Zinc Comics presents, live from Darshan Studios, Exposition with Brian Payne. Hello, hello. Welcome to the show. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about different things, but I should never have gotten on eBay because I keep finding interesting things and spending money I can ill afford to buy them. But I bought a bunch of comic journals. The Fantagraphics book about comic criticism, and I had originally thought I'd do a show about that, but I'm really not good at condensing, or you don't want me to read these things live, so I'm just using them for ideas. But every issue is really interesting, and I end up going down different paths and finding things I'm interested in. One of them being Steve Canyon. I was always a fan of the strip in the newspaper, and I still am, but I recently bought a lot of Steve Canyon magazine, the kitchen sink version, not the earlier one. And that led me into looking into all things Milton Caniff. So let's just see what we're talking about here. Okay. Now, the recent issue I read was Comics Journal number 108, I believe. And it had an interview with Milton Caniff that I found really interesting. And for those not familiar, the Milton Caniff was the Rembrandt of the comic strip. Dickie Dare begat Terry and the Pirates. Terry and the Pirates begat Steve Canyon. And the interview in of Milt Caniff was conducted by Catherine Collins, who was then known as Arn Saba, who drew Neil the Horse, if you're familiar with that comic. But anyway, although common opinion appears to be that Terry and the Pirates is Milton Caniff's high watermark, I actually prefer the first 5 years or so of the Steve Canyon strip. The first 5 years of Steve Canyon are examples of Caniff's genius at the height of its powers, methinks. In 1952, he hired Dick Rockwell, Norman Rockwell's nephew, as an assistant, and he took over the penciling and most of the inking on the strip. Caniff still inked the main characters and wrote it, however, but it was up until then, it was kind of Steve Canyon's baby. And unlike Terry and the Pirates, he owned Steve Canyon. So that was one of the main reasons he left Terry and the Pirates, was because the syndicate owned Terry and the Pirates, and Steve Canyon he owned, although he leased the rights to someone, Marshall Fields or something like that. And they, in turn, leased it to the, I believe, Chicago Tribune Syndicate, but I'm not sure. Steve Canyon ran from January 13th, 1947 until June 4th, 1988, shortly after Caniff's death. In the early issues strips, Canyon was originally an Air Force vet. Well, he always was that, but he had founded a charter service called Horizons Unlimited with a crew of fellow veterans. And there was a guy who was into ham radio, the ladies' man. It was kind of like the Blackhawk crew. And I believe Steve Canyon's crew came first, but don't quote me on that. But I think one influenced the other, and I think it was Blackhawk was influenced by Steve Canyon. But again, it's one or the other. I'm not sure about which was which, but that's what I think. And gradually, that crew got phased out and was replaced by different characters, but he always had a sidekick. Happy Easter was the original, and then it became, I believe, Reed Kimberly, who was younger and very much like Terry in Terry and the Pirates, and to Steve Canyon's older. And then there were many femme fatales. Fita Fita was his office assistant, and Miss Mizzou and Copper Calhoun, Summer Olson, these just to name a few. But these issues were the Steve Canyon magazine reprinted a certain number of strips per issue, uh, bigger than the Checker books that did that, but still not large enough. The Sundays are large, but I just wish, I know, I believe it's IDW is reprinting these collections. I wish I could afford those, but I really enjoyed this Kitchen Sink magazine. I only have 3 issues, but that's quite a few strips, and carried a lot of the storyline through. And in the interview, there's a couple quotes I really liked by Milton Caniff. And one was, I'm delighted when somebody says this is not just cartoons to be thrown away or to be wrapped around a fish tomorrow. It's art. And he always acted like he was a newspaper man, and I think that's that's how he got his start. And it was for him to sell newspapers was his mission. And he says that, it's nice when people call his stuff art, but it's not for him to say. And he wasn't being very heavy and humble like Uriah Heeps neither. He just felt like that wasn't his place. It was for other people to determine what it was. His job was to sell newspapers and get a strip out every day of the week, which, I just can't. I'm lucky enough to get a comic book, a 24-page comic book out in a year. To do a daily comic strip would be a daunting task. And I know a few people who are doing that now. Terry Beatty is currently doing Rex Morgan, MD, writing, drawing, and penciling, much like Milt Caniff was. And he just always seems to be up against the deadline doom, or trying to stay one step ahead of it at least. And I think it's a good gig. I mean, we should all be so lucky, but it's definitely a lot of work, and not something that comes by one easily, which is why a lot of the old newspaper comic strip artists had ghost assistants, or people assisting them, much like manga artists do, because they had to get their stories into print each week as well, only it was often in 10, 20-page chunks. So trying to get that out in a week is a pretty daunting task as well. I mean, a monthly comic book nowadays, how many people stay on a book more than a year tops? You know, what did Jack Kirby do, 100 issues of Fantastic Four or something? And then, of course, Dave Sim did 300 issues of Cerebus. originally on a bi-monthly basis, but turned quickly into a monthly book. And yeah, he had Gerhard to do the backgrounds after the first 50 or so. And he did a lot of heavy lifting, but still writing, drawing, inking, and publishing your own comic book. I can't begin to imagine the pressure that you're into and the discipline required to do such a long-term work. Another quote from Milton Caniff that I really liked was, "One great advantage of mine is that I'm the writer, artist, director, the costume designer, the whole works." And I know I've only worked from a script once and I made changes and I don't think they were appreciated. It's hard for me to imagine, a writer can write, okay, uh, this is a air airport at night, um, and there's 30 armed soldiers with armor light rifles, and you should be able to determine their names by the name tags on their chest in a script. But to draw that thing, it would be impossible. So I think Frank Miller, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says when you write and draw that you basically write and draw what you like. And that's a something that I've taken to heart, because I basically draw talking heads, so I don't get too far outside my comfort zone. Although I try, I'm not trying to stay stagnant. But a lot of people think talking heads is boring, but I don't. And I like But one thing Steve Canyon strips and Milt Caniff was able to do in them was to draw talking heads. But he could make a guy talking on a telephone dramatic by turning the camera angle, for want of a better word, in a circular motion around him in one single strip. And there's an example of that in Steve Canyon. But he could make two people talking on the telephone dramatic, and that's a hard task. And I'm not sure I'm up to it, but that's one thing that I really love about Steve Canyon and Milt Caniff's work. And a lot of the early Terry and the Pirates, which is great, but you can see him getting better as it goes. And early on, it's almost like a Roy Crane style, but it gradually gets more and more what we have come to know as Milton Caniff's work. And when he started out at doing the new Steve Canyon strip, he was already at the height of his powers and fully formed as an artist, and he hit the ground running, and he really seemed to have something to prove. I know later on that a lot of people thought that Steve Canyon was square, and that Milton Caniff was kind of a hawk once the Korean War came along, and even more so during the Vietnam War. But in the interview, he really seemed to belie that myth. And he basically was supportive of the troops, but not always the war. And he seemed to not really be behind the Vietnam War as much as one might think, or as he has been portrayed in the past. But again, I really loved these kitchen sink comics, Steve Canyon magazine. I'm really into the magazine format. In fact, I've been picking up a lot of, not only the Comics Journal, but the Steve Canyon magazine, some old Punisher comic magazines where they basically reprint the comic books, but in black and white and at magazine size. And the NAM, they did the same thing, Marvel did. And I recently picked up Will Eisner's Quarterly, which has interviews in it that called Shop Talk, where Will Eisner talks with different comic professionals, and they talk about everything under the sun, old days, new days, technique, everything. And it has new work by him being serialized, and then also some old reprints of the spirit strips and the ones that also appeared in the spirit section, Mr. Mystic, or that might not be the right title, but all those other strips that appeared in the spirit section as well. I've always been more into comic strips rather than comic books, and I read comic strips long before I ever read a first comic book. And that's always been where I wanted to do a comic strip, but that's a hard gig to get, even on a weekly basis, let alone to be in a daily in the paper. And nowadays, there's a lot of perennial strips, and that's both good and bad. But recently, a lot of great artists have taken over those adventure soap opera strips that date way back. Rex Morgan, MD, Prince Valiant, Mary Worth, even, are all being drawn by great artists at this time who you would recognize their names from the comic books of the past. So I think that's, if they're going to have perennial strips, at least get good artists working on them. And I think they are. I really enjoy reading Terry Beatty's Rex Morgan, MD. And I know that kind of makes me square, but hey, consider the source. Also in this comics book journal, there is an article about A Distant Soil. And if you look at the middle of your screen, you'll see the first issue. Colleen Doran came up with the concept for A Distant Soil as a teenager, and it was first published in 1983 by Warp Graphics, the publishers of ElfQuest. And both ElfQuest and A Distant Soil are another example of this oversized, almost magazine format that I'm really liking. I can see why early Love and Rockets was in the magazine format and why they went back to it. There's something to be said by the more wide page and short, squarer format rather than the long, thin thing you find in most comic books. It just gives the art more room to breathe, I think. Doran plotted and drew the comic for the first 5 issues of A Distant Soil, but the dialogue was written by Richard Penny, who is Wendy Penny's husband and editor of Warp Graphics ElfQuest. So he's kind of like the publisher, which a lot of these companies, they have their spouse being their publisher. I know, Denny Sim, Dave Sim's wife, was originally the publisher of Cerebus. The Bone by Jeff Smith, his wife is the publisher. Stray Bullets, by David Lappin. His wife is the publisher. Strangers in Paradise by Terry Moore. His wife is the publisher. So, it helps to have someone in the family watching out for your interests, I think. But I think that Richard Penny working for Duran got so used to working with his wife that I think that proved to be part of the problem. Again, this is just my conjecture on my point. But I know that Duran and Penny had contractual disagreements and disputes over who really created and owned a distant soil. And it led to two, I believe, lawsuits or legal actions, or at least a lot of back and forth in the press. And Duran redrew and wrote the comic for a color graphic novel from Downing after reaching an agreement with Warp. But the company later filed a lawsuit against both Duran and Downing for an alleged break of their original agreement. And that's what this Newswatch article in Comics Journal was basically talking about, was Duran pulling the book, citing contractual violations, editorial interference, and from Warp Graphics, and taking it out on her own. I also know that the first 5 issues were scripted by Richard Penny, but she took over writing with issue 6, I believe. And there were 9 issues published by Warp Graphics, but I think there was a lot of argument back and forth between her and Richard Penny during the 6, 7, 8, and 9. But 9 issues were published by Warp Graphics. One thing interesting about those issues was that they were printed uninked, just from the original pencils for that entire 9-issue run. And in '83, I don't know how many people were doing that. Gene Colan, perhaps, but I don't know if he was even doing that at that time. And I guess the way they did the lettering was they lettered on acetate overlays and painted white paint on the back, almost like animation cells, and laid it over the pencils. And that's the way the pages were shot. So I did not know that before I recently picked up the first 5 issues of A Distant Soil again on eBay. I got to stay away from that. I really do. Fair warning to all of you: stay off eBay, especially late at night. Because after reading this article, I wanted to read those 5 issues that Richard Penny had written, and it just gets better by leaps and bounds, issue by issue. And I think Colleen Doran was all of 18 or so at the time. She definitely got into the business early. And, she eventually took that book to Downing, ended up getting into another lawsuit with Richard Penny, then self-published it herself. What was her imprint? Area Press, I believe. And then she took it to Image. And I know a few years back she was revamping it because she used a lot of Zipatone. And I think, in the old days, pre-scanner, that was not a problem. But nowadays, scanners can take Zipatone that's actually on the board and create these moire patterns and weird optical effects that were not intended. So she was having to go through, much like Dave Sim did on Cerebus, and do a lot of work to get these old pages to be able to print nowadays in the digital age of comics. Excuse me, I had to wet my whistle again. One thing Colleen Doran made clear in this article in Newswatch is that Richard is not the creator of Distant Soil. I am. Although I do believe it's Richard Penny who came up with the title A Distant Soil, which is like a quote from a poem. I'm not sure whose poem at the moment, but I think it's the title was taken from a line in a poem. And I find it funny that in the letter columns, I guess people have trouble remembering the title A Distant Soil and are calling it everything from Far Away Dirt to I don't know what else, but Far Away Dirt sounds pretty cool myself. Perhaps someone should make a comic called that. But anyway, I really recommend Steve Canyon. Any version of old reprints is good, but the Steve Canyon magazine in particular, I really enjoy. And A Distant Soil is really cool. And Colleen Doran is really active in social media. And I think you can find her, on, I'm not sure about Twitter, but Facebook. She has a website and I believe a blog. Oh, she always has good opinions and a lot to say on comics. And it's good to see her reminisce about the old days because there used to be, that self-publishing group, Jeff Smith with Bone, Star Child by Owens, Hepcats by Wagner, and of course Dave Sim with Cerebus, and they kind of hung around together back in the day. And you used to see a lot of pictures of them together and jam prints and stuff. So I tend to think of them all together. And I kind of have a fondness for the second generation, the Martin Wagner Hepcats, the James Owens Star Child. I was never a huge fan of Bone. I know a lot of people think it's the best of the lot, but for me, give me Star Child and Hepcats. I know Hepcats has become a running joke on the Kayfabe channel with Ed Pisker and Jim Rugg, but I actually like the comic a lot, and I think comics misses Martin Wagner at this point. We hardly knew you, and Star Child in particular is a favorite of mine, and James Owen has gone on to write a series of young adult novels and that he does illustrations for. But those first 12 issues, especially of Star Child, are particularly great, methinks. Anyway, I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. And whatever I do nowadays is going to come under the title Exposition. I really don't have a format or an ongoing schedule, but I'll be dropping it back in from time to time, and I hope you'll check out the broadcasts when you can. But until next time, everybody out there, remember, think Zinc.